The morning of August 15th, 1942, began like any other at the Japanese Naval Intelligence Bureau in Tokyo. Commander Takeshi Naito sat at his desk, surrounded by reconnaissance photographs, agent reports, and decoded American radio traffic. For the past 9 months since the triumph at Pearl Harbor, his job had been to track American military production, particularly their armored forces. The numbers on the page before him should have been routine. Instead, they represented an impossibility that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The photographs showed American M4 Sherman tanks being loaded onto transport ships in San Francisco. Naito had counted them personally. 47 tanks in a single convoy. That was manageable, even expected. But when he cross-referenced this with similar counts from San Diego, Seattle, and Pearl Harbor over the previous 3 weeks, the total climbed to over 300 tanks in 3 weeks. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the intelligence estimate his office had compiled in October of 1941, 11 months earlier. According to their careful surveillance of American military bases, the entire United States Army possessed approximately 400 tanks. 400 total. Yet in the past month alone, American forces in the Pacific had deployed nearly that many. The mathematics didn't just fail to add up. They described something that violated every assumption Japanese strategic planning had relied upon since the decision to go to war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Naito's confusion was not the product of incompetence. He was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most meticulous intelligence officers, trained in the rigorous analytical methods that had served Japan well in previous conflicts. The estimate of 400 American tanks had been compiled through systematic observation over 18 months. Japanese diplomatic staff, military attachés, and undercover agents had photographed American military installations from California to Maryland. They had counted tanks at Fort Knox, Fort Benning, and the Marine Corps base at Quantico. They had observed training exercises and documented equipment movements. Every sighting had been catalogued, cross-referenced, and verified. The number wasn't a guess. It was the product of professional intelligence work conducted exactly as Naito had been trained to do it. The problem was that everything Naito had been trained to do was based on a fundamental assumption, that industrial capacity existed within certain rational limits. In Japan, tank production was a laborious process. The Mitsubishi Heavy Industries plant in Tokyo could produce approximately 10 Type 97 Chiha medium tanks per month when operating at full capacity. This output required the total coordination of Japan's limited steel, industry, specialized machine tools that took months to manufacture, and skilled workers who had trained for years in precision metalwork. To Japanese military planners, this represented the natural ceiling of what an industrialized nation could achieve. When they looked at American tank production, they unconsciously applied the same framework. If Japan, with its entire industrial might focused on war production, could build roughly 120 tanks per year, then surely the United States, even with its larger economy, might manage 3 or 4 times that number. 400 tanks seemed not just reasonable but generous. What Naito and his colleagues had failed to account for was that American industry didn't operate under the same constraints. In 1941, the United States was not yet a nation at war, and the tank park Naito's agents had observed represented peacetime production, a military establishment starved of funding throughout the 1930s, equipped with obsolete machines and minimal procurement budgets. The 400 tanks were real, carefully counted, and accurately reported. But they represented not American capability, but American neglect. The actual industrial infrastructure that would produce American armor didn't exist yet in October of 1941, so Japanese intelligence couldn't observe it, and because it couldn't be observed, it couldn't be believed. The conceptual framework that made this misunderstanding possible had deep roots in Japanese military culture. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had spent decades perfecting the doctrine of decisive battle, the idea that superior training, discipline, and spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantages. Japanese officers studied the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, where smaller Japanese forces had defeated the massive but poorly organized Russian military. They analyzed conflicts where quality trumped quantity, where better-trained soldiers overcame numerical superiority through tactical excellence and fighting spirit. This worldview made a certain kind of sense when applied to warfare between relatively comparable industrial powers, but it became catastrophically misleading when applied to the United States, a nation whose industrial capacity existed on a scale Japan's military leadership literally could not conceptualize. The intelligence failure extended beyond simple miscounting. In the summer of 1941, a Japanese naval officer named Lieutenant Commander Suguru Suzuki had visited Detroit as part of a diplomatic mission. His official role was to observe American industrial techniques that might be applicable to Japanese manufacturing. Unofficially, he was there to assess American war production potential. Suzuki spent 3 days touring automobile factories, Ford's River Rouge plant, Chrysler's main assembly complex, and General Motors facilities in Flint. His report, filed in C.S. September of 1941, described what he saw with professional precision. Vast assembly lines producing automobiles at rates of 1 vehicle every 48 seconds, automated machinery that eliminated the need for skilled craftsmen, and an industrial workforce that numbered in the tens of thousands at single facilities. Yet even Suzuki's detailed observations failed to generate alarm in Tokyo. The report was read, filed, and largely dismissed. The reasoning seemed sound. Automobile production and tank production were fundamentally different enterprises. A car required perhaps 3,000 parts assembled in a specific sequence. A tank required armor plate rolled to precise specifications, specialized tracks, a cannon with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, complex transmission systems, and fire control mechanisms of extraordinary precision. This was not work that could be accomplished by semi-skilled laborers on an assembly line. It required craftsmen, specialists, engineers working with careful deliberation. The fact that America could produce millions of cars meant nothing for its ability to produce thousands of tanks, or so the analysis concluded. This reasoning would have been sound if applied to Japanese industry, where the transition from civilian to military production required complete retooling, new training regimens, and fundamental changes in manufacturing philosophy. But American industry had been designed from its inception around principles of interchangeable parts, mass production, and rapid retooling. The same engineers who designed systems to produce identical carburetors by the million could apply those principles to tank transmissions. The same workers who assembled automobile engines could, with minimal retraining, assemble tank power plants. The assembly line itself, the fundamental American contribution to industrial organization, proved eerily adaptable to military production. On December the 7th, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, Imperial headquarters operated under strategic assumptions built on Naito's intelligence estimates. The United States had 400 tanks, perhaps 1,000 combat aircraft, and a navy that, while numerically superior, could not possibly sustain combat operations across the vast distances of the Pacific, while simultaneously confronting German U-boats in the Atlantic. Japanese war planners estimated they had 18 months to secure the southern resource area, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and establish a defensive perimeter so formidable that America would negotiate rather than pay the blood price of reconquest. 18 months seemed generous. After all, if America possessed only 400 tanks, how long would it take them to build the thousands needed to mount offensive operations across the Pacific? Years, certainly. Perhaps the entire duration of the war. The initial campaigns vindicated this. Assessment. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with stunning speed. In Malaya, where British forces had a numerical advantage, superior Japanese tactics and training led to the capture of Singapore in just 70 days. In the Philippines, American and Filipino defenders fought with desperate courage, but were overwhelmed by Japan's advantages in combat experience and air superiority. By April of 1942, Japan had secured every strategic objective planned for the first phase of the war. The defensive perimeter stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, encompassing the resource-rich territories that would fuel Japan's war machine. And American resistance had been exactly as ineffective as predicted, under-equipped, poorly coordinated, unable to slow the Japanese advance. But Commander Naito, reviewing intelligence reports in his Tokyo office, had begun noticing anomalies. In the Philippines campaign, American forces had employed more tanks than they were supposed to possess in the entire Pacific theater. The numbers weren't dramatic enough to trigger alarm. Perhaps Japanese estimates had undercounted by 20 or 30%, a normal margin of error. But then came reports from Australia, where American forces were beginning to stage defensive operations. Reconnaissance flights over ports showed tanks being unloaded in quantities that seemed inconsistent with previous estimates. Again, not dramatically so. Enough to be noticed, not enough to cause panic. The reconnaissance photographs from San Francisco in August changed everything. Naito spread them across his desk in chronological sequence. June 15th, July 1st, July 15th, August 1st, August 15th. Each showed the same docks, the same loading cranes, the same transport ships, and each showed tanks, dozens of them in every photograph. Not the same tanks being photographed repeatedly, but different machines in different loading configurations, identifiable by unit markings and minor variations in external stowage. When Naito plotted the timeline, the implication became impossible to ignore. The United States was shipping tanks to the Pacific at a rate of approximately 40 per week. 40 per week meant 160 per month. 160 per month meant nearly 2,000 per year. But America had only possessed 400 tanks 9 months ago. Where were they coming from? Naito requested everything Japanese intelligence had compiled on American industrial production since Pearl Harbor. The reports arrived in fragmentary form: decoded radio traffic, mentioning factory expansion, agent observations of increased rail traffic around Detroit, aerial reconnaissance showing new construction at industrial sites. Individually, each report meant little. Collectively, they described an industrial mobilization of staggering scope, but the numbers still didn't make sense. Even if America had doubled or tripled its tank production capacity, that might yield 400 or 500 tanks per month. The deployment rates Naito was observing required something closer to 1,000 tanks per month. That kind of production would require not factory expansion, but the construction of entirely new industrial complexes operating on a scale that didn't exist anywhere in the world. On September 3, 1942, a Japanese submarine intercepted and decoded an American radio transmission that included a reference to production schedules at the Chrysler tank arsenal. The transmission was fragmentary, but it included a number: tank hole number 4-47, completed August 28th. Naito stared at that number for a long time. If Chrysler had completed tank number 4047 by late August, and if production had begun sometime after Pearl Harbor, that implied a production rate of approximately 500 tanks per month from a single factory. A single factory producing more tanks in 1 month than Japan's entire industrial base could manufacture in a year. The number was so preposterous that Naito's first instinct was to assume a decryption error. But when he reviewed the intercept personally, the mathematics was clear. Hull number 4047, late August, one facility. He began pulling files on Detroit, the city Suguru Suzuki had visited the previous year. The industrial intelligence was sparse. Most of Japan's pre-war observation had focused on military bases, not civilian manufacturing centers. But what existed painted an incomplete picture of extraordinary scope. Detroit contained not one automobile factory, but dozens. Ford's River Rouge complex alone employed nearly 100,000 workers and could produce finished automobiles at rates exceeding 8,000 per week. If even a fraction of that capacity converted to tank production, Naito stopped himself. The assumption was absurd. Tank production couldn't possibly scale that way. The precision required, the specialized components, the armor plate rolling, these were not assembly line processes, except, apparently, they were. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By October of 1942, American tanks were appearing in the Pacific Theater in quantities that made Naito's original estimates look not merely wrong, but delusional. At Guadalcanal, where Japanese and American forces were locked in a brutal struggle for control of Henderson Field, Marine Corps units deployed with M3 Stuart light tanks and M4 Sherman medium tanks in company-strength formations. A company comprised 14 tanks. The Marines had multiple companies. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reported encountering American armor with increasing frequency, not as rare, decisive weapons deployed at critical moments, but as standard equipment integrated into routine infantry operations. Naito compiled every intelligence report from Guadalcanal that mentioned American tanks. The numbers climbed. 14 tanks destroyed in action on September 12th. 8 more were observed during a reconnaissance patrol on September 19th. 22 counted during an American counterattack on October 7th. These weren't cumulative totals. They were individual engagement reports, and they represented only the tanks the Japanese forces actually encountered in direct combat. The total American tank inventory on Guadalcanal had to be substantially higher. Yet Guadalcanal was a secondary theater, a contested island 7,000 miles from the American mainland. If the Americans could deploy dozens of tanks to Guadalcanal while simultaneously conducting operations in North Africa, preparing for campaigns in New Guinea, and maintaining training establishments in the continental United States, their total production had to number in the thousands. The breaking point came in November. Japanese intelligence intercepted a partially decoded American logistics report that included aggregate production figures for American armored vehicle manufacturing. The document was fragmentary, with large sections unreadable, but the portions that survived decryption were unambiguous. In the month of September 1942 alone, American factories had produced 1,854 tanks. Not 1,854 tanks total since Pearl Harbor. Not 1,854 tanks projected for the entire year. 1,854 tanks in a single month. September. Naito read the number 3 times before he allowed himself to accept what it meant. If September's production was 1,854 tanks, and if that represented typical output, not a peak, just normal monthly production, then American yearly production would exceed 20,000 tanks. 20,000. Japan's total wartime tank production, from December 1941 through the end of the war, would eventually reach approximately 6,000 tanks. America was producing Japan's entire wartime tank inventory every 3 months. Every 3 months, American factories were creating from raw steel an armored force larger than everything Japan would build during 4 years of total war. The psychological impact on Naito was immediate and profound. This wasn't a matter of American production exceeding Japanese estimates by 20 or 30%, a normal intelligence failure, the kind that could be corrected with better methodology. This was a catastrophic failure of imagination, a complete inability to conceptualize what modern American industry was actually capable of achieving. And the failure wasn't limited to tank production. Similar reports were coming in regarding aircraft manufacturing, where American monthly production appeared to be approaching 3,000 planes. Ships, where American yards were launching Liberty cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Ammunition, where American monthly small arms cartridge production exceeded 50 million rounds. Every category of military production showed the same pattern. American output operating at scales that made comparative analysis with Japanese capacity meaningless. What made the revelation particularly devastating was that it arrived too late to matter. By November of 1942, Japan was already locked into a strategic path based on fatally flawed assumptions. The defensive perimeter had been established. Forces had been committed. Supply lines had been drawn. The entire Japanese war plan presumed a relatively brief conflict in which Japan secured vital resources, established unassailable defensive positions, and forced America to negotiate from a position of military stalemate. That plan required America to be the nation Japanese intelligence had observed in 1941, under-equipped, industrially constrained, unable to project overwhelming force across the Pacific. But that America had never actually existed. It had been a temporary condition, a snapshot of peacetime neglect that bore no relationship to American industrial potential once fully mobilized. Naito began investigating how the miscalculation had occurred. The answer, he discovered, lay not in faulty intelligence gathering, but in faulty interpretation. Japanese intelligence had done exactly what it was trained to do: observe, document, and analyze based on existing frameworks. The framework itself was the problem. When Japanese analysts assessed American industrial capacity, they unconsciously used Japanese industry as the reference model. In Japan, tank production occurred at specialized military arsenals, where craftsmen hand-fitted components with precision tools. The idea of producing tanks on assembly lines, using semi-skilled labor and interchangeable parts manufactured to tolerances that eliminated the need for custom fitting, was conceptually foreign. It wasn't how serious military equipment was built, or so Japanese industrial philosophy insisted. But American industrial philosophy had evolved along entirely different lines. The principles that Henry Ford had pioneered at Highland Park in 1913, moving assembly lines, interchangeable parts, extreme division of labor, had been refined over 3 decades into a manufacturing system of extraordinary efficiency. When Ford's engineers designed the B-24 Liberator bomber production line at Willow Run, they applied automobile manufacturing principles to aircraft construction. The result was a facility that could produce a 4-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes at peak operation. Not 63 hours. 63 minutes. From raw materials to flyable aircraft in just over 1 hour. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal represented a similar application of American mass production principles to armored vehicle manufacturing. The facility, located in Warren, Michigan, had broken ground in September of 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. Construction proceeded at a pace that would have been impossible in Japan, where building a new industrial complex required years of planning and careful resource allocation. The Chrysler Arsenal went from bare ground to initial production in just 7 months. By June of 1942, it was producing M3 Grant medium tanks. By August, production had shifted to the M4 Sherman, a more advanced design that would become the standard American medium tank for the remainder of the war. The numbers that emerged from Chrysler defied everything Japanese military planners understood about industrial production. At peak capacity in 1943, the Chrysler arsenal would produce one complete M4 Sherman tank every 48 minutes. The facility operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Monthly output reached 500 tanks, more than Japan's entire industrial base produced in a year. And Chrysler was not the only American tank factory. The Fisher Body Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, produced another 300 tanks per month. The Ford Motor Company's facility produced tank engines and components at similar rates. The Pressed Steel Car Company in Pittsburgh converted from railroad car production to tank manufacturing. The American Locomotive Company in Schenectady, New York, did the same. Pacific Car and Foundry in Renton, Washington, joined the network. In total, 11 major facilities produced M4 Shermans, with dozens more producing components, armor plate, weapon systems, and automotive parts. What made this production network particularly devastating from a Japanese strategic perspective was its redundancy and resilience. Japan's tank production depended on a handful of specialized facilities, primarily Mitsubishi plants in Tokyo and Nagoya. If those facilities were destroyed or disrupted, Japanese tank production would cease entirely. American production was distributed across the entire continental United States in cities separated by thousands of miles. Even massive bombing campaigns, of the type that would eventually devastate Japanese industry, couldn't meaningfully impact American output because there was simply too much of it, spread across too wide an area, backed by too much raw material and too many workers. The steel production figures alone told the story. In 1942, Japan produced approximately 4 million tons of steel. The United States produced 60 million tons. The disparity wasn't a matter of degree. It was a difference in kind, a gulf so vast that direct comparison became meaningless. Japan could optimize, streamline, and maximize efficiency, but no amount of superior organization could overcome a 15-to-1 disadvantage in raw industrial capacity, and that disparity extended to every category of strategic resource. Oil production. Japan controlled access to Dutch East Indies petroleum, but produced approximately 50 million barrels per year. The United States produced over 1 billion barrels annually. Machine tools, Japan had perhaps 20,000 precision lathes and milling machines in 1942. The United States had nearly 1 million. Electrical generating capacity. Japan's entire electrical grid produced less power than the Tennessee Valley Authority alone. Commander Naito compiled his findings into a comprehensive intelligence assessment in December of 1942. The report ran to 47 pages and included detailed production estimates, facility locations, and strategic implications. The conclusion was stark. Japan could not win an extended industrial war against the United States. The material disparity was too great, the production differential too extreme. Japan's only viable strategy had always been the one pursued: rapid conquest, defensive perimeter, negotiated settlement. But that strategy required America to accept a negotiated peace rather than commit to total war. And America, Naito noted, with professional detachment, showed no inclination toward negotiation. The report was forwarded to Imperial General Headquarters. It was read, discussed, and filed. Nothing changed. The war continued along its predetermined path because no alternative existed. Japanese forces in the Pacific dug in, prepared defensive positions, and awaited the American counteroffensive they knew was coming. That offensive would be supported by industrial production operating at levels Japanese war planners had believed impossible. But belief was irrelevant now. The tanks were real, manufactured by the thousands in factories that ran 3 shifts per day, shipped across the Pacific in cargo vessels that America produced faster than Japan could sink them. manned by crews trained in tank schools that graduated more men each month than Japan's entire armored force comprised. The strategic consequences manifested throughout 1943. At Tarawa, American forces assaulted a heavily fortified Japanese position supported by M4 Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers. The Japanese garrison had prepared for an infantry assault, perhaps supported by a handful of tanks deployed at critical moments. Instead, they faced a coordinated armor and infantry attack, where tanks weren't rare weapons but standard equipment, deployed in numbers that overwhelmed defensive preparations. At Saipan in June of 1944, American forces landed with over 700 armored vehicles, more tanks in a single operation than Japan had deployed across the entire Pacific theater. The Japanese defenders, fighting with extraordinary courage from prepared positions, discovered that courage couldn't stop 30-ton steel machines advancing behind artillery barrages that expended more ammunition in a single day than Japan's monthly production. The human cost of the intelligence failure was measured not in tanks, but in lives. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific fought with the expectation that their sacrifice would contribute to eventual victory, or at least to a negotiated peace that preserved some core Japanese interests. That expectation rested on strategic assumptions about relative military capacity, assumptions that Naito's intelligence reports had definitively disproven by late 1942. Yet the war continued for nearly 3 more years, with Japanese forces defending positions that had no strategic value, conducting operations that could not alter the war's trajectory, dying in battles that served no purpose beyond delaying the inevitable. The tragedy wasn't that Japanese soldiers lacked courage or determination. It was that their courage and determination were expended in service of strategic objectives that had become mathematically impossible the moment American industry fully mobilized. Naito remained at his post throughout the war, compiling intelligence assessments that documented American material superiority with increasingly precise detail. By 1944, his reports no longer estimated American production. They simply recorded observed output based on intercepted logistics data and reconnaissance observations. The M4 Sherman production numbers climbed from 1,500 per month in early 1943 to over 2,000 per month by mid-1944. Total American tank production for the war would eventually exceed 88,000 armored vehicles. Japan's total production remained below 6,000. The 8-month period that had so troubled Naito in August of 1942, the span during which he first noticed the discrepancy between Japanese estimates and American deployment rates, eventually revealed its full scope. From January through August of 1942, American factories produced approximately 18,000 tanks. 18,000. In 8 months. More tanks than Japan would produce during the entire war. More tanks than the British had fielded during the entire First World War. More tanks than existed in the entire world combined when the war began. The number represented not merely industrial capacity, but a fundamental revolution in warfare itself. The transformation of armored vehicles from specialized weapons deployed at decisive moments into mass-produced commodity items manufactured on the same assembly lines that had previously produced family automobiles. What haunted Naito in the war's final years was not that Japanese intelligence had failed to predict this production level. That would have been impossible, given the available information in 1941. What haunted him was how long it had taken to recognize the truth even when evidence accumulated. The reconnaissance photographs from mid-1942 had shown the reality clearly. The intercepted production data had provided specific numbers. The battlefield reports from Guadalcanal had documented American material abundance in tactical detail. Yet acceptance had been delayed resisted, minimized, because accepting the truth meant accepting that Japan had entered a war it could not win, against an opponent whose industrial capacity operated on a scale that made Japanese resistance, however valiant, ultimately meaningless. The conceptual failure was one of imagination rather than intelligence. Japanese military planners had studied American society extensively. They knew America was wealthy, industrialized, technologically advanced. But they had interpreted these facts through a framework shaped by Japanese industrial experience. In Japan, industrial production was limited by access to raw materials, availability of skilled workers, capacity of specialized machinery, and physical constraints of factory space. These were real limitations that imposed hard ceilings on production rates. Japanese planners assumed, reasonably based on their own experience, that similar limitations constrained American industry. They were wrong. American industry in 1942 operated under constraints of a different kind, not physical limits, but organizational and motivational ones. American factories could produce almost anything in almost any quantity, but only if properly organized and motivated to do so. Pearl Harbor provided the motivation. American industrial engineers provided the organization. The result was production on a scale that Japanese planning had categorized as theoretical impossibility. By 1945, when American bombers began systematic destruction of Japanese industrial centers, Naito's intelligence assessments no longer concerned American production rates. There was no point. American material superiority was absolute, undeniable, and growing. Instead, Naito focused on damage assessment, documenting the destruction of Japan's own industrial base under American bombardment. The Mitsubishi plant in Tokyo that had produced 10 tanks per month was reduced to rubble in March of 1945. The Nagoya facilities suffered similar destruction. By August, Japan's tank production had effectively ceased. America, meanwhile, was producing over 2,000 tanks per month, though by that point in the war, production was being scaled back because the existing inventory exceeded tactical requirements. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that Naito listened to in his office, the same office where, 3 years earlier, he had first confronted the impossible mathematics of American tank production. The Emperor's words referenced a new and most cruel bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Naito understood that the atomic bombs, however terrible, were not fundamentally why Japan had lost. Japan had lost because it had entered an industrial war against an opponent whose production capacity exceeded Japan's by orders of magnitude. The atomic bombs ended the war in August rather than November or December. But the war's outcome had been determined much earlier, perhaps in December of 1941. When America's industrial mobilization began, certainly by mid-1942, when American production reached levels that made Japanese victory impossible. In the decades after the war, historians would debate the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, examining the strategic logic, the diplomatic failures, the military calculations. Many of these analyses would note that Japanese planners understood they were taking an enormous risk. That victory required a short war and negotiated settlement. That extended conflict favored America's industrial strength. These assessments were accurate as far as they went, but they tended to understate the sheer magnitude of the miscalculation. Japanese planners hadn't merely underestimated American industrial capacity, they had failed to comprehend that such capacity could exist. The 400 tanks that Japanese intelligence counted in October of 1941 were real. The methodology was sound. The analysis was professional. The conclusion that America possessed limited armored forces was accurate based on observable evidence. The catastrophic error was assuming that what could be observed represented the limit of what was possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.